St. Mary Mead wore its autumn finery with the quiet pride of a village that had perfected the art of seasonal celebration over countless generations. The ancient church of St. Bartholomew stood sentinel over the festivities, its Norman stones warmed by the golden October sunlight that streamed through windows depicting saints whose names had been forgotten by all but the most devoted historians. Around the churchyard, the harvest festival stalls displayed the bounty of the season. Pyramids of russet apples, great orange pumpkins that seemed to glow within a light, and baskets of late roses whose fragrance mingled with the earthy scent of turning leaves. Miss Jane Marple sat on the small wooden chair that Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife, had thoughtfully placed in the shade of the ancient yew tree. From this vantage point, she could observe the gentle chaos of village life with the serene attention that had become her hallmark. Her knitting needles moved with practiced rhythm, creating delicate lacework that seemed far too intricate for such casual surroundings. Yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that the most complex patterns often emerged from the simplest, most repetitive motions. The Reverend Arthur Pemberton moved among his parishioners with the comfortable authority of a man who had shepherded the same souls for nearly 2 decades. His wife, Eleanor, possessed that particular gift of remembering everyone's ailments and anniversaries, making her indispensable to the smooth operation of parish life. Near the cake stall, Mrs. Dolly Bantry held court with her usual mixture of genuine warmth and barely contained curiosity about everyone else's business. Mr. Alistair Finch, the church organist and choir master, supervised the arrangement of chairs for the afternoon concert with the meticulous attention he brought to all his endeavors. A precise man in his middle 50s, he had come to St. Mary Mead 3 years earlier with excellent references and an almost passionate dedication to musical excellence that had transformed the village choir from a well-meaning collection of voices into something approaching genuine artistry. The star of this musical transformation was young Thomas Hartwell, barely 14, but possessed of a soprano voice of such pure, ethereal quality that visiting clergy had been known to pause mid-sermon simply to listen. Thomas was a quiet boy, often found reading in corners, with the kind of thoughtful intelligence that adults found both charming and slightly unsettling. Today, however, Miss Marple noticed something different about him. The boy's usual calm demeanor seemed strained, his gaze frequently shifting toward the group of adults gathered near the church entrance. Among those adults stood Lady Constance Ashworth, whose recent arrival in the village had caused considerable excitement. A widow of substantial means, she had purchased Ashworth Manor and immediately set about establishing herself as a patron of local institutions. Her interest in the church choir, and particularly in young Thomas, had been both generous and somewhat intense. She had funded new robes, arranged for additional music lessons, and spoke frequently of the boy's exceptional potential in tones that suggested personal investment beyond mere philanthropy. Such a gifted child deserves every opportunity, Lady Ashworth was saying to Colonel Weatherby, the church warden, as Miss Marple's sharp ears caught fragments of their conversation. I've spoken to contacts in London about possible scholarships. The boy could go far with proper guidance. Colonel Weatherby, a man whose military bearing remained impeccable despite his 70-odd years, nodded with the careful politeness of someone who found Lady Ashworth's enthusiasm slightly overwhelming. Very generous of you, Lady Ashworth, though I do hope the lad won't be rushed into anything. Village life has its own pace, you know. It was during this conversation that Miss Marple observed young Thomas approach the group of adults, only to halt abruptly when he overheard Lady Ashworth's words about London and scholarships. The boy's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little color it had possessed. He stood frozen for a moment, then quickly reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small folded piece of paper. With movements that spoke of sudden, desperate decision, Thomas glanced around to ensure he was unobserved, then deliberately dropped the paper near the base of the ancient stone cross that marked the center of the churchyard. The action was so swift and seemingly casual that Miss Marple doubted anyone else had noticed it. The boy then turned and walked quickly toward the church, his shoulders rigid with what appeared to be barely controlled distress. Miss Marple's knitting needles never paused in their rhythm, but her keen blue eyes remained fixed on the spot where the paper had fallen. Experience had taught her that when children resorted to such furtive communications, the adult world had usually failed them in some fundamental way. The afternoon concert commenced with the punctuality that Mr. Finch demanded of all musical endeavors. The small audience settled into their chairs with a satisfied air of people fulfilling both social obligation and genuine pleasure. The choir, dressed in their new robes courtesy of Lady Ashworth's generosity, took their positions with the mixture of pride and nervousness that marked all amateur performances. Thomas stepped forward for his solo, the opening notes of Jerusalem rising from his throat with the pure clarity that had made him the pride of St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple, watching with the attention she brought to all human behavior, noticed the slight tremor in his hands, and the way his eyes seemed to search the audience as if looking for something or someone he both hoped and feared to see. The song reached its soaring climax, Thomas's voice filling the autumn air with heartbreaking beauty. As the final note faded and appreciative applause began, Miss Marple saw the boy's gaze fix on Lady Ashworth, whose face wore an expression of almost proprietary satisfaction. In that moment, Thomas's composure finally cracked. His face crumpled with what looked distinctly like despair, and he stumbled slightly as he returned to his place among the other choristers. The concert concluded to warm applause, and the audience began to disperse toward the tea tables. It was then that Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through the pleasant chatter with a note of genuine alarm. "Has anyone seen Thomas? He was here just a moment ago." A search began, casual at first, then increasingly urgent as it became clear that the boy had simply vanished. It was young Peter Blackwood, another chorister, who finally pointed toward the church tower with a trembling finger. "I saw him go in there," Peter whispered. He looked awful scared." Colonel Weatherby and Mr. Finch immediately headed for the tower entrance, their footsteps echoing hollowly on the ancient stone steps. The rest of the village gathered in the churchyard, their festive mood rapidly giving way to anxiety. The cry that came from the tower minutes later was one that would haunt the memories of everyone present. It was Colonel Weatherby's voice, stripped of its usual military composure. "Dear God, Pemberton, call the police. Call them now." When the facts finally emerged, they were stark and shocking. Thomas Hartwell had been found at the base of the tower's internal staircase, his neck broken from what appeared to be a fall from the upper levels. Clutched in his hand was a piece of paper, not the one Miss Marple had seen him drop, but another note entirely, written in the same careful script. Dr. Haydock, summoned from his afternoon rest, confirmed what everyone feared. The boy was dead, apparently from injuries sustained in the fall. Whether accident or something more deliberate remained to be determined, but the note in Thomas's hand suggested the latter possibility with chilling clarity. As the police were summoned and the churchyard gradually emptied of all but the most essential personnel, Miss Marple quietly made her way to the stone cross. The paper Thomas had dropped earlier was still there, partially hidden by fallen leaves. She retrieved it with the careful movements of someone accustomed to handling evidence, unfolded it, and read the few lines written there in the same neat hand that had penned the note found with the boy's body. The words were brief but deeply troubling. "They want to send me away. They say it's for my own good, but I know the truth. I know what he did. I know why she really wants me gone. If something happens to me, look for the music. The answer is in the music." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her handbag. Around her, the golden afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the churchyard, where, just hours before, the village had gathered in celebration of the harvest. Now those same stones bore witness to a tragedy that would shake St. Mary Mead to its foundations. As she walked slowly home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of adult ambitions and childhood fears that seemed to have culminated in this terrible afternoon. Thomas Hartwell's death might indeed prove to be a tragic accident, but his final notes suggested otherwise. Someone in the village harbored secrets dark enough to drive a sensitive boy to desperation, and Miss Marple suspected that the Harvest Festival had been merely the stage for the final act of a drama that had been building for some time. The gentle rhythm of village life had been shattered, and it would fall to her, as it so often did, to carefully examine the pieces and discover what pattern they formed when properly arranged. For, in her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that the most innocent-seeming communities often harbored the darkest secrets, and that children, in their clarity of vision, sometimes saw truths that adults spent great effort to conceal. By morning, the harvest bunting looked oddly frivolous against a sky the color of wet slate, and St. Mary Mead behaved as villagers do when tragedy strikes by discussing it with such intensity that conversation became a defense against contemplation. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Clegg pulled pints with unusual solemnity while repeating that young Thomas had always been a dreamer, and dreamers sometimes fail to watch their footing on treacherous stone steps. Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed to anyone within earshot that the tower stairs had been a scandal for years, damp and neglected, and if the parochial church council had heeded her Easter letter, there would be no funeral to arrange now. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with the morning train, his blunt presence immediately transforming the village's comfortable speculation into something more urgent and official. Mrs. Dolly Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's cottage before breakfast was properly cleared, her hat askew in a way that suggested haste rather than fashion. "My dear Jane," she began without preamble, settling into the familiar chintz chair, "they're saying there was a note clutched in the poor boy's hand, something about being sent away and knowing secrets. Inspector Slack questioned half the village before dawn, and Lady Ashworth is in what I can only describe as controlled hysterics, insisting Thomas was meant for London by Michaelmas." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, though the folded paper in her handbag seemed to pulse with significance. "Notes are curious things, Dolly," she observed mildly, often more revealing about who is meant to find them than what they actually say. The conversation turned inevitably to Lady Ashworth's role in recent events, and Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing privileged intelligence. "I spoke with Mrs. Henderson at the post office, and she mentioned Thomas had been asking odd questions this past week about train schedules to London and whether letters posted locally might be intercepted before reaching their destinations. Rather sophisticated concerns for a village boy, don't you think?" Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their rhythm as she processed this information, her mind already connecting threads that others might dismiss as coincidental. Dr. Haydock joined them within the hour, his medical bag still in hand, and his usual brisk manner subdued by the weight of the previous day's discoveries. "The physical evidence supports a fall from height," he reported with careful professional detachment. "But I'm troubled by aspects that don't align with simple accident. Thomas knew that tower intimately, and he wasn't given to reckless behavior." He paused, his expression growing more troubled. "Now that recent events have focused my attention, I recall Thomas visiting my surgery 3 days ago, complaining of headaches and sleeplessness. I prescribed mild remedies and attributed his distress to growing pains, but looking back, I wonder if there were signs of deeper troubles that I failed to recognize properly." Colonel Weatherby arrived as the morning progressed, his military bearing intact despite the obvious strain of recent events. "Inspector Slack is thorough. I'll grant him that," he reported, "though he's already forming theories that make me uncomfortable. The note found with Thomas mentioned knowing what he did, and fears about being sent away, which Slack interprets as evidence of some improper relationship. He's particularly interested in questioning Mr. Finch about his methods with the choir boys." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly at this intelligence, her mind cataloguing the implications, while her expression remained serenely attentive. The discussion was interrupted by young Peter Blackwood appearing at the garden gate, his face pale and his usual boyish confidence replaced by obvious distress. Miss Marple invited him in with the gentle authority that children instinctively trusted, settling him with milk and biscuits while drawing out his observations with patient questions. "Thomas said something odd last week during choir practice," Peter revealed hesitantly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "He said you could tell what people really felt by listening to how they sang their vows, and that someone's vows were all wrong, like they were lying with their mouth but telling the truth with their throat. He was laughing when he said it, but not really laughing, if you understand." Miss Marple understood perfectly, filing this observation alongside the cryptic reference to music in Thomas's hidden note. After Peter departed and her other visitors gradually took their leave, she made her way to the church where she found Mr. Finch arranging. Music with the precise movements of a man seeking comfort in familiar routines. The organist's usual composure seemed strained, his responses to her gentle inquiries about Thomas's recent behavior carefully measured. "Such a gifted child," he murmured, "such potential lost to us all. The pressures of scholarship opportunities, Lady Ashworth's ambitious plans perhaps proved overwhelming for such a sensitive nature." On the music stand lay sheets of anthem arrangements in Finch's characteristically neat handwriting, and Miss Marple's observant eye caught a page deliberately folded to conceal marginal notations that appeared to be coded references rather than standard musical directions. When she inquired about his marking system, Finch closed the score with perhaps unnecessary haste, explaining that he annotated pieces for clarity and proper interpretation. As Miss Marple walked home through streets where afternoon shadows were already lengthening, she reflected on how tragedy had revealed the hidden currents flowing beneath their village's placid surface. Currents that had apparently caught young Thomas Hartwell with fatal consequences, and she suspected the music he had referenced in his final, desperate message held keys to understanding the forces that had driven him to such desperate measures in their seemingly peaceful community. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead with unusual persistence, as if the village itself were reluctant to face another day of questions and suspicions, and Miss Marple made her way toward the church with the measured pace of someone who understood that truth, like good lace, required patience and careful attention to pattern. Inspector Slack's temporary headquarters in the vestry had transformed the sacred space into something resembling a military operation, with constables coming and going at regular intervals, their heavy boots echoing hollowly against stones that had witnessed centuries of quieter devotions. Miss Marple positioned herself on the bench near the lych gate, her knitting providing perfect camouflage for observation, and watched as the inspector's methodical questioning gradually stripped away the comfortable veneer of village respectability. When Mrs. Pemberton emerged from her interview, her usual serene composure had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety, and she paused beside Miss Marple with the desperate air of someone seeking reassurance from a familiar face. "Inspector Slack has such peculiar theories about Thomas," she confided, her voice trembling slightly. "He seems convinced that someone in our small community harbored dark intentions toward that poor boy, as if St. Mary Mead were some den of iniquity rather than a peaceful parish where everyone has known everyone else for decades." Miss Marple murmured sympathetic agreement, while noting how Mrs. Pemberton's hands shook as she adjusted her gloves and how her gaze kept drifting toward the tower windows with an expression that suggested knowledge she preferred not to examine too closely. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Ashworth, whose usual commanding presence seemed diminished by the careful way she held herself, as if sudden movement might shatter her carefully maintained composure. Her interview with Inspector Slack lasted nearly an hour, and when she emerged, her face was flushed with what appeared to be suppressed indignation. "That man has the most extraordinary imagination," she declared, settling heavily beside Miss Marple without invitation. He seems to believe that my interest in Thomas's musical education was somehow improper, that my plans for his advancement were the cause of his distress, as if wanting to nurture exceptional talent were a crime rather than a Christian duty. Yet Miss Marple detected something hollow in these protestations, a quality that suggested Lady Ashworth was working harder to convince herself than her audience. Mr. Finch appeared shortly afterward, his usual precise movements replaced by obvious agitation as he fumbled with his music case. Lady Ashworth's demeanor changed immediately upon seeing him, her expression hardening into barely concealed hostility. "I trust Inspector Slack's questions weren't too taxing," she said with acid sweetness, "though I suppose those of us who truly cared for Thomas's welfare have nothing to hide from official scrutiny." The organist's mumbled response was barely audible, but Miss Marple caught the flash of something that might have been fear in his eyes before he hurried into the church, and she made a mental note to examine his behavior more carefully when opportunity arose. After both had departed, Miss Marple made her way to the cottage where Thomas had lived with his aunt, Martha Jenkins, a stern but kindly woman whose grief had carved new lines in her weathered face. Over tea and biscuits, Martha spoke of Thomas's recent transformation from eager scholarship candidate to withdrawn, anxious boy. "He was so excited about London at first," she revealed, her voice heavy with regret. Lady Ashworth filled his head with dreams of grand concert halls and famous teachers. But then something changed, Miss Marple. He became secretive, spending hours with his music scores, humming strange little melodies that sounded more like codes than songs. This information connected powerfully with Peter Blackwood's earlier observation about vowels and truth-telling, and Miss Marple began to suspect that Thomas's reference to finding answers in the music might be more literal than metaphorical. Later, when the church had emptied of officials and curious villagers, Miss Marple slipped into the vestry, where she found Mr. Finch's music folios arranged with characteristic precision. The neatness itself was revealing, for Miss Marple had learned that excessive order often served to conceal rather than clarify, and she examined the scores with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most significant clues were frequently hidden in plain sight. On several pieces, she discovered faint pencil markings that appeared to be coded notations, tiny dots and vowel symbols placed not where a choir master would normally mark breathing or emphasis, but over passing notes that any competent singer would handle instinctively. It was exactly the sort of detail that a musically gifted boy might notice, especially one who had been told that truth could be detected in the way people shaped their vowels. As evening shadows lengthened across the churchyard, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of adult ambitions and childhood fears that seemed to be emerging from her investigation. Thomas's desperate notes suggested he had discovered something that made him fear being sent away, something connected to the musical codes she had found, and involving at least one person whose public behavior masked private deception. The tensions between Lady Ashworth and Mr. Finch clearly went deeper than simple disagreement about musical education, and Inspector Slack's focus on improper relationships might be missing the true nature of the conspiracy that had driven a sensitive boy to such desperate measures in their seemingly peaceful village community. Inspector Slack's confidence in his emerging theory became unmistakable when he summoned the village's key figures to the church hall, his blunt manner suggesting he believed the case was approaching resolution with satisfying efficiency. The assembled group included Lady Ashworth, who sat with aristocratic rigidity, Mr. Finch, whose nervous fidgeting betrayed inner turmoil, Colonel Weatherby maintaining military composure despite obvious discomfort, and the Reverend and Mrs. Pemberton, both wearing expressions of bewildered distress that their peaceful parish had become the scene of such sordid speculation. Miss Marple positioned herself near the back with her knitting, observing how each person's body language revealed far more than their carefully chosen words, noting particularly how Lady Ashworth's gaze never quite met Mr. Finch's, while the organist seemed to shrink whenever the inspector's attention turned his way. "The evidence points to a clear pattern of improper interest in young Thomas," Inspector Slack announced with the satisfaction of someone who believed complexity could be reduced to simple criminal categories. The boy's notes reference knowing what he did and express fear about being sent away, suggesting someone was using their position of authority inappropriately. His gaze fixed meaningfully on Mr. Finch, whose face had gone pale as parchment. We have testimony that the deceased spent unusual amounts of time alone with his choir master, had access to the church at all hours, and his behavior had become increasingly secretive and distressed in recent weeks. The inspector's words hung like an accusation, and Miss Marple observed how the room's occupants reacted with varying degrees of shock, indignation, and what appeared to be carefully suppressed relief that suspicion was focusing elsewhere. Lady Ashworth rose with theatrical dignity, her voice cutting through uncomfortable silence with aristocratic authority. "Inspector, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I must protest this character assassination of a man whose only crime was dedication to musical excellence. Mr. Finch transformed our choir from village mediocrity to professional standard, and Thomas flourished under his guidance until other pressures began affecting his emotional state." Her defense seemed generous until Miss Marple noticed how it subtly redirected blame while maintaining her own position as Thomas's primary benefactor. The boy's distress stemmed from anxiety about the scholarship opportunities I'd arranged, the pressure of leaving familiar surroundings for London's competitive musical world. Mr. Finch finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Thomas was like a son to me," he managed, his hands trembling as he cleaned his spectacles with obsessive precision. "I would never have harmed him, never done anything improper. He came to me with questions about music, about life, about things that troubled him, but our relationship was entirely appropriate, entirely professional." Yet Miss Marple detected something evasive in his manner, suggesting he was telling partial truth while concealing information he deemed too dangerous to reveal, and she began to suspect his fear stemmed not from guilt over improper conduct, but from knowledge of someone else's secrets. Colonel Weatherby cleared his throat with military precision, his weathered face set in stern disapproval. "Inspector, I've known Finch since he arrived, and I've observed his work closely in my capacity as church warden. His conduct has been exemplary, his methods professional, and his results remarkable. If you're suggesting impropriety based solely on a boy's distressed ramblings, you're barking up entirely the wrong tree." The colonel's defense carried weight due to his reputation for moral rectitude, but Miss Marple noticed how his eyes avoided both Lady Ashworth and Mr. Finch while he spoke, suggesting his certainty might be less complete than his words implied. Miss Marple listened to the growing chorus of accusations against Mr. Finch with quiet skepticism that was almost imperceptible. She observed the choir master's reactions to escalating pressure, his pallor and nervous darting eyes. But she saw something in his distress that resonated more with fear than guilt. The faint pencil markings in his music scores, those dots and vowel symbols that were clearly not conventional musical notations, suggested someone communicating secrets rather than hiding them. Peter Blackwood's innocent remark about Thomas discerning truth in vowel sounds kept returning to her, indicating a level of subtle communication that Inspector Slack would entirely overlook. The inspector's theory, while plausible on the surface, felt too neatly packaged, too obvious. Miss Marple knew that human nature rarely presented such straightforward patterns. She considered the differences between Thomas's two notes, subtle but significant variations that suggested deliberate staging rather than spontaneous revelation. Furthermore, she had observed the undeniable tension between Mr. Finch and Lady Ashworth that went beyond rivalry over Thomas, hinting at deeper, more personal animosity rooted in shared past or hidden conflict. As the gathering dispersed with nothing resolved except increased suspicion and mutual distrust, Miss Marple made her way home through streets that seemed to whisper with secrets, her mind working to separate genuine clues from red herrings that proliferated when fear replaced reason. Inspector Slack's theory had appealing simplicity, but it failed to explain the coded musical notations, the specific reference to truth being revealed through vowel sounds, or the complex dynamics suggesting their conflict involved more than disagreement about Thomas's education. And she suspected the real truth would remain hidden beneath layers of adult deception until someone properly decoded those cryptic annotations. The morning brought a persistent drizzle that seemed to muffle St. Mary Mead's usual sounds, creating an atmosphere of hushed expectancy that Miss Marple found conducive to careful observation and methodical investigation. She made her way to the church with the measured pace of someone who understood that truth, like fine embroidery, required patience and attention to seemingly insignificant details that others might overlook in their haste to reach obvious conclusions. The vestry, temporarily transformed into Inspector Slack's headquarters, buzzed with official activity, but Miss Marple had learned that the most revealing conversations often occurred in the quiet moments between formal interrogations, when people believed themselves unobserved and allowed their carefully constructed facades to slip. Mrs. Pemberton, emerging from yet another session with the inspector, appeared visibly shaken by the persistent questions about Thomas's behavior and the various adults who had influenced his short life. Inspector Slack seems determined to find scandal where none exists, she confided to Miss Marple, her voice trembling with barely controlled anxiety. He's convinced that someone in our peaceful community harbored dark intentions toward that poor boy, as if kindness and musical instruction were somehow sinister rather than charitable Christian duties. Miss Marple murmured sympathetic agreement, while noting how Mrs. Pemberton's hands shook as she fumbled with her prayer book, and how her gaze kept drifting toward the tower with an expression that suggested knowledge she preferred not to examine too closely. When Mrs. Pemberton was called away by urgent parish business, Miss Marple found herself alone in the vestry with access to the church records that had been temporarily displaced by the inspector's investigation. Among the neat rows of hymnals and service books, she discovered a slim ledger that had been pushed behind the larger volumes, almost as if someone had attempted to conceal it from casual observation. The accounts within revealed a pattern of financial irregularities that cast the recent events in an entirely different light. Collection totals that didn't quite match the recorded deposits, payments for tower repairs that seemed excessive for the work actually completed, and mysterious donations from Lady Ashworth that appeared to coincide with unexplained shortfalls in the church's operating funds. Most intriguingly, several entries bore the initial W in Colonel Weatherby's distinctive handwriting, suggesting his involvement in financial arrangements that required discretion rather than transparency. Miss Marple had observed enough parish politics to recognize the signs of well-intentioned but irregular bookkeeping, the kind of creative accounting that occurred when respected community members attempted to solve problems quietly rather than expose embarrassing deficits to public scrutiny. Thomas's reference to knowing what he did began to take on new significance when viewed through the lens of financial impropriety rather than personal misconduct. Her examination of the ledger was interrupted by voices approaching the vestry, and Miss Marple quickly replaced the volume behind its concealing row of hymnals before settling herself with her knitting in an attitude of innocent occupation. Lady Ashworth and Colonel Weatherby entered deep in conversation, their voices pitched for privacy, but carrying clearly in the stone-walled space. The figures will reconcile properly, if given sufficient time, Lady Ashworth was saying with the careful control of someone managing a delicate situation. However, I cannot continue to subsidize irregular arrangements indefinitely without proper documentation and accountability. Colonel Weatherby's response carried the crisp authority of his military background, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that suggested discomfort with the current circumstances. The understanding was that the boy would be established in London before Michaelmas, removing him from local concerns that might prove awkward for all involved parties. Lady Ashworth's reply was barely audible but carried an unmistakable note of reproach. You left the arrangements too close to the festival date, and boys of Thomas's intelligence are naturally inquisitive about adult affairs that affect their futures. The conversation ceased abruptly when they noticed Miss Marple's presence, transforming immediately into the kind of pleasant but meaningless social exchange that adults used to conceal more significant discussions. Miss Marple contributed appropriate responses about the weather and Sunday's hymn selections, while her mind processed the implications of what she had overheard. The adult's concern about Thomas's curiosity, combined with the financial irregularities she had discovered, suggested a conspiracy of good intentions that had somehow gone terribly wrong. Later, as she made her way home through streets still glistening with moisture, Miss Marple encountered young Peter Blackwood near the churchyard gate. The boy's usual cheerful demeanor had been subdued by recent events, but he brightened when Miss Marple paused to inquire about his well-being with the gentle interest that children instinctively trusted. "Thomas was ever so clever about music," Peter confided, his voice carrying the mixture of admiration and loss that marked childhood grief. "He could tell things about people just by listening to how they sang certain words, like their voices were telling secrets even when they didn't mean to." This observation resonated powerfully with Thomas's cryptic reference to finding answers in the music, and Miss Marple encouraged Peter to elaborate on his friend's unusual abilities. "He said you could hear when grown-ups were worried or lying, because their voices got tight in funny places, especially on the long vowel sounds." Peter explained with a matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to phenomena adults might dismiss as imagination. He'd been making little marks in his music book, tiny dots and things, whenever he noticed someone's voice doing something odd during practice. As Miss Marple continued her walk home, she reflected on how Thomas's sensitive musical ear might have detected emotional undercurrents that escaped adult notice, and how his innocent observations could have been misinterpreted as evidence of adult misconduct, rather than simply the natural anxiety that accompanied financial irregularities and hastily arranged solutions. The boy's tragic death was beginning to appear less like the result of scandalous secrets and more like the unfortunate consequence of adult complications that a perceptive child had only partially understood, leading to fears and desperate actions that no one had anticipated or desired in their seemingly peaceful village community. The morning mist had lifted to reveal a village that seemed to hold its breath, and Miss Marple made her way through streets where ordinary conversations had taken on the weight of potential evidence, each casual remark scrutinized for hidden meaning by neighbors who had suddenly discovered they knew far less about each other than they had assumed. Her first visit was to Martha Jenkins, who had requested the meeting with the desperate urgency of someone carrying a burden too heavy for solitary bearing, and when Miss Marple arrived at the modest cottage where Thomas had spent his brief life, she found the boy's aunt clutching a worn leather satchel as if it contained the last remnants of her nephew's innocence. Martha's weathered hand trembled as she opened the satchel to reveal Thomas's personal notebook, a small volume filled with meticulous observations about vocal techniques and the subtle ways that emotional states affected musical performance, page after page of careful analysis that revealed a child's growing awareness of adult deceptions hidden beneath the surface of daily interactions. "He was always writing in this," Martha explained, her voice soft with remembered affection mixed with present anguish. "Said he could hear when people were worried or lying because their voices got tight in certain places, especially on the long vowel sounds, and he'd been making little marks whenever he noticed someone's voice doing something odd during church services." The notebook's contents painted a picture of a perceptive child gradually becoming aware of tensions he couldn't fully understand, with entries describing how Lady Ashworth's breathing patterns changed when she sang near Mr. Finch, how Colonel Weatherby's usually steady bass voice developed a noticeable tremor during financial announcements, and how certain conversations carried what Thomas had termed false notes that made him uncomfortable without knowing why. Dr. Haydock arrived as Martha was departing, his medical bag suggesting professional duties, but his manner indicating personal concern about the direction of Inspector Slack's investigation and the growing atmosphere of suspicion that threatened to destroy the reputations of innocent people. I've been reviewing Thomas's medical history with fresh eyes, he began without preamble, settling into the familiar chair with the comfortable ease of an old friend. The boy's increasing visits to my surgery, complaints of headaches and sleeplessness that I initially attributed to academic pressure, now appear to be symptoms of genuine anxiety disorder caused by exposure to adult conflicts he couldn't process properly. His weathered face reflected years of experience with village secrets and the damage they could inflict on sensitive souls. Thomas wasn't suffering from guilt about imagined misconduct, Miss Marple, but from fear about something specific that made him feel trapped between conflicting adult loyalties he didn't fully comprehend. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Ashworth Manor provided crucial context for understanding the complex relationships that had shaped recent events as Lady Ashworth received her in the morning room, where telephone conversations about trustees and discretions suggested ongoing complications requiring careful management. The elegant surroundings, with a scent of beeswax and lilies, seemed designed to impress and intimidate, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a framed photograph on the mantel showing a cathedral choir from years past, among them a youthful Alistair Finch, whose features were softer but recognizably precise. "Winchester, years ago," Lady Ashworth supplied before being asked, her smile carrying undertones of satisfaction mixed with something that might have been regret. "My late husband supported their music bursary program, and Mr. Finch was among the beneficiaries. Such pleasing symmetry when circumstances allow the circle to return." The remark revealed layers of obligation and expectation that cast their current relationship in an entirely different light, suggesting that Lady Ashworth's interest in the church choir involved settling old debts as much as nurturing new talent. When Miss Marple encountered Mr. Finch later that afternoon, walking quickly with his music case held as if it contained something fragile and precious, his usual nervous energy had been replaced by a kind of defeated resignation that spoke of secrets too heavy to bear alone. "Thomas kept a little exercise book for analyzing vowels," he admitted when she inquired about the boy's private observations. "I thought it a childish fancy, but he insisted it helped him hear what people meant rather than what they said, and he'd been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about the connections between vocal stress and emotional truth." His face went pale when he learned that Inspector Slack had found no such notebook among Thomas's belongings, followed by a flicker of alarm that suggested he understood the implications. "Then someone has it," he murmured with obvious distress, "and someone understands more than is safe for any of us involved in this unfortunate situation." The financial irregularities that Miss Marple had discovered in the church ledger began to take clearer shape as she observed the subtle tensions between the adult players in this tragic drama, noting how Colonel Weatherby's usual military composure seemed strained whenever Lady Ashworth appeared, and how their conversations carried the careful quality of people managing a delicate situation that could explode into scandal if mishandled. Thomas's references to knowing what he did and fears about being sent away were beginning to make terrible sense as the desperate measures of adults who had allowed good intentions to lead them into compromising positions that a perceptive child had detected through his unusual sensitivity to vocal deception and emotional undercurrents. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple reflected on how the pieces of this puzzle were forming a pattern that had little to do with the scandalous theories Inspector Slack was pursuing and everything to do with the complex web of financial necessity, personal obligation, and misguided attempts to protect reputations that had somehow culminated in a sensitive boy's tragic death. The musical codes in Thomas's notebook, those faint pencil markings documenting vocal irregularities during church services, were not evidence of criminal conspiracy, but the innocent observations of a gifted child who had stumbled onto adult secrets without possessing the experience necessary to interpret them safely, and whose growing awareness of deception in the adult world had filled him with fears that no one had recognized or addressed before it was too late to prevent the desperate action that had cost him his young life in their seemingly peaceful community. The morning brought news that would transform Inspector Slack's confident theories into something far more complex and troubling, for just as the village had begun to settle into the uncomfortable certainty that Mr. Finch represented their resident villain, a cry of alarm from the direction of St. Bartholomew's shattered the autumn quiet with the urgent terror that only fire can inspire in communities where ancient timber and stone hold centuries of irreplaceable history. Miss Marple, who had been tending her roses with the methodical care that mirrored her approach to human nature, immediately recognized the significance of smoke curling from the vestry window, understanding instinctively that second crimes in small communities rarely occurred by coincidence, particularly when they involved the destruction of records that might contain inconvenient truths about respected citizens' private affairs. The fire brigade from Much Benham arrived with commendable efficiency, but not before considerable damage had been done to the vestry's interior, where the acrid smell of charred wood and burning paper created an atmosphere of loss that seemed to settle over the assembled villagers like a physical weight. Inspector Slack emerged from the blackened room with soot-streaked determination, his earlier confidence about Mr. Finch's guilt now complicated by evidence that someone had deliberately attempted to destroy church records, financial ledgers, and musical scores with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly which documents posed the greatest threat to carefully constructed deceptions. The inspector's immediate assumption that the organist had resorted to arson to conceal evidence of improper conduct seemed logical on the surface, yet Miss Marple observed the reactions of other key figures with the attention she brought to all human behavior under stress. Colonel Weatherby's response to the fire proved particularly revealing, for beneath his military composure and offers of assistance to the fire chief, Miss Marple detected the subtle signs of relief mixed with anxiety that suggested personal investment in what had been destroyed rather than simple concern for church property. His eyes lingered on the section where financial records had been stored, and his questions about which specific documents had survived the flames carried an urgency that transcended normal curiosity about parish business. Lady Ashworth, arriving later with appropriate expressions of dismay, maintained her aristocratic control while displaying the same careful interest in the fate of particular ledgers and account books, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she inquired about the extent of damage to what she termed important historical documents. Mr. Finch's devastation at the loss of his musical scores appeared genuine, his grief over years of careful arrangements and annotations reduced to ash, seeming to overwhelm any concern about Inspector Slack's renewed suspicions. Yet Miss Marple noted how his lamentations focused on his own compositions while mentioning Thomas's work almost as an afterthought, suggesting that whatever the boy had discovered in his musical observations had been recorded separately from the materials destroyed in the fire. When Mrs. Henderson from the post office arrived with a singed envelope she had discovered in her sorting room, containing a page from Thomas's notebook with its telltale dots marking vowel sounds during particular hymns, the true significance of the boy's musical analysis began to emerge with chilling clarity. The page revealed Thomas's innocent but perceptive documentation of vocal stress patterns during Colonel Weatherby's financial reports, and Lady Ashworth's responses to questions about her donations, his childish handwriting noting how certain words carried false sounds that made him uncomfortable without understanding their adult implications. Miss Marple recognized immediately that Thomas's sensitive ear had detected the emotional strain of people involved in financial irregularities, their voices betraying anxiety and deception even as their words maintained appropriate parish business, and his growing awareness of these adult secrets had made him an unwitting threat to carefully maintained reputations built on unauthorized borrowing and creative accounting designed to conceal temporary shortfalls in personal finances. As the investigation shifted focus from alleged improper conduct to financial conspiracy, Miss Marple reflected on how the fire represented not desperate destruction of evidence by a guilty organist, but calculated elimination of records by someone who understood that Thomas's observations, combined with the church's financial documents, could expose a complex web of well-intentioned but ultimately criminal behavior involving respected community members whose pride had prevented them from seeking help through proper channels. The boy's tragic death was beginning to appear as the unintended consequence of adult attempts to remove him from the village before his innocent questions and perceptive observations could unravel deceptions that had grown far beyond their creator's ability to control or contain. The true villain's deception, Miss Marple now understood, involved not the corruption of innocence but the protection of reputation through increasingly desperate measures that had culminated in a sensitive child's death, in the systematic destruction of evidence that might reveal how good intentions and financial necessity had created a conspiracy of silence that had ultimately proven more dangerous than the original problems it was designed to solve. As evening shadows lengthened across the churchyard, where blackened timber still smoldered, she prepared to examine more carefully the remaining threads of this complex web, knowing that the most calculating criminals often hid behind facades of respectability and charitable concern, using the very virtues they claimed to protect as weapons against those whose innocence made them inconveniently observant witnesses to adult failures and moral compromises in their seemingly peaceful village community. The morning after the fire brought a peculiar clarity to Miss Marple's thoughts, the kind of crystalline focus that emerged when scattered pieces of human behavior suddenly aligned into recognizable patterns, and she determined that the time had come for what she privately termed a small experiment designed to test her growing suspicions about the true nature of Thomas Hartwell's tragic death. Her plan required the cooperation of the Reverend Pemberton, whom she approached with a gentle suggestion that an informal service of prayer and remembrance might provide comfort to a parish still reeling from recent events, particularly if it included the singing of familiar hymns that had brought Thomas such joy during his brief life. The Reverend, eager to offer his congregation any measure of peace, readily agreed to Miss Marple's proposal, and she carefully selected hymns that Thomas had marked repeatedly in his notebook with those telltale dots and annotations, pieces whose long vowel sounds would prove particularly revealing when sung by voices under emotional strain. Word of the evening service spread through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that characterized all village communications, and when the church bell called the faithful to gather, Miss Marple observed with satisfaction that all the key players in her developing theory had chosen to attend. Lady Ashworth arrived with her usual punctuality and composed demeanor, her elegant black coat and carefully arranged hat suggesting someone determined to maintain appearances despite the growing scrutiny surrounding recent events. Yet Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain in the way her gloved hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she arranged herself in the pew. Colonel Weatherby took his customary position near the aisle, his military bearing intact but somehow diminished, his prayer book held with the rigid precision of someone using familiar rituals as armor against uncomfortable thoughts. Mrs. Pemberton settled into her accustomed place with obvious nervousness, her usual serene confidence replaced by the anxious demeanor of someone who feared that hidden knowledge might be forced into unwelcome revelation. When the first hymn began, Miss Marple allowed her voice to blend with the congregation, while her attention focused entirely on the subtle variations in vocal production that Thomas's sensitive ear had taught her to recognize as indicators of emotional distress and deception. Lady Ashworth's approach to the word mercy carried a barely perceptible tightening that spoke of guilt requiring forgiveness, while Colonel Weatherby's voice developed an unmistakable tremor when the verse touched on themes of remembrance and accountability for past actions. Most significantly, Mrs. Pemberton's breathing pattern became noticeably irregular during the phrase, "Deliver us," the same words that Thomas had marked with 3 insistent dots in his notebook, suggesting her involvement in events that required divine intervention for resolution. As the service progressed through the carefully chosen selections, Miss Marple's observations confirmed her growing understanding of the complex web of financial irregularities and misguided attempts at concealment that had ultimately cost Thomas his life. The boy's musical sensitivity had allowed him to detect the emotional strain in adult voices during parish meetings where money matters were discussed. His innocent questions about borrowing and repayment gradually revealing his awareness of unauthorized transactions that threatened to expose respected community members to scandal and possible criminal charges. After the final hymn faded into contemplative silence, Miss Marple made her way through the dispersing congregation with the measured pace of someone who had accomplished her immediate objective, pausing to exchange pleasantries that served the dual purpose of maintaining her cover while observing final reactions to the evening's carefully orchestrated test. Lady Ashworth's farewell carried forced brightness that failed to mask underlying anxiety. Colonel Weatherby's handshake lingered with the desperate pressure of someone seeking reassurance, and Mrs. Pemberton's hurried departure suggested someone eager to escape further scrutiny of her emotional responses. The true significance of the evening's experiment became clear as Miss Marple walked home through streets where autumn mist created pools of shadow and concealment, her mind processing the vocal evidence she had gathered with the systematic attention she brought to all forms of human communication. Thomas's tragic death was indeed the result of adult conspiracy, but not the scandalous impropriety that Inspector Slack had imagined, rather a complex arrangement involving financial necessity, unauthorized borrowing from church funds, and increasingly desperate attempts to conceal what had begun as temporary solutions to personal monetary difficulties. The fire in the vestry now appeared as a calculated attempt to destroy evidence of financial irregularities that Thomas's perceptive observations had threatened to expose, while his planned removal to London represented not educational opportunity, but necessary elimination of an inconveniently observant witness whose musical ear had detected deception in the voices of adults who believed their secrets were safely hidden. As Miss Marple prepared for bed in her comfortable cottage, she reflected on how the most dangerous criminals often wore masks of respectability and charitable concern, using the very virtues they claimed to protect as weapons against those whose innocence made them threats to carefully constructed facades of community standing and moral authority in their seemingly peaceful village. Miss Marple understood with the quiet certainty that came from decades of observing human nature that the moment had arrived for truth to emerge from the carefully constructed shadows where it had been hidden by well-meaning but ultimately murderous deception. And so she extended invitations with characteristic gentle insistence to Lady Ashworth, Colonel Weatherby, Mrs. Pemberton, and Mr. Finch for what she termed a brief memorial discussion in the church tower, where Thomas's voice had so often soared with pure, innocent beauty. The setting was deliberate, for Miss Marple had learned that confronting people with the scene of their crimes often produced revelations that comfortable sitting rooms could never elicit, and when the small group assembled at the base of the ancient stone steps, she observed with practiced attention how each person's demeanor shifted subtly in the presence of those worn treads that had witnessed Thomas Hartwell's final, desperate moments. As they climbed toward the bell chamber, Miss Marple maintained pleasant conversation about harvest decorations and Sunday hymns, while noting how Mrs. Pemberton kept to the inner wall with unusual care, how Colonel Weatherby's military bearing seemed forced, and how Lady Ashworth's usual commanding presence appeared diminished by barely concealed anxiety that made her breathing shallow and irregular. When they reached the narrow landing where autumn light filtered through diamond-paned windows, Miss Marple paused with apparent concern, examining the stone steps with grandmotherly attention, before remarking casually about a troubling scuff mark on the seventh tread that suggested someone had stumbled or struggled at that precise spot during recent weeks. Ninth tread, Colonel Weatherby corrected with automatic precision, then stopped abruptly as color drained from his weathered face, his military composure cracking as he realized what his intimate knowledge of the crime scene had revealed about his presence during Thomas's final moments. Miss Marple's gentle smile acknowledged his slip with devastating kindness as she continued her careful examination of the stones. noting aloud how the pattern of marks suggested not accidental stumbling, but deliberate force applied by someone familiar enough with the tower's layout to know exactly where a small boy might lose his footing if pushed with calculated violence. The revelation unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all of Miss Marple's investigations as she explained how Thomas's remarkable musical sensitivity had made him far more dangerous to certain adults than anyone had initially realized. His innocent ability to detect emotional deception through vocal analysis, transforming him from scholarship candidate into unwitting threat to carefully maintained reputations built on financial irregularities and unauthorized borrowing from church funds. The poor boy's notebook contained detailed observations about how voices betrayed anxiety during parish meetings, she explained with quiet sadness. Particularly when Colonel Weatherby discussed finances, or Lady Ashworth mentioned her generous donations, which were actually carefully disguised repayments designed to cover shortfalls that would have destroyed respected community members if exposed to public scrutiny. Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally shattered as Miss Marple's gentle but relentless exposition revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had developed around Thomas's growing awareness of adult deceptions, her usual serene dignity collapsing into desperate sobs as she confessed her role in orchestrating both the financial cover-up and the boy's tragic death. He was asking such innocent questions about borrowing and repayment, making those careful notations about our voices during hymns when we thought our anxiety was hidden, she whispered through tears of genuine remorse. The London scholarship was meant to remove him before his observations could unravel everything we had worked so desperately to protect. But when he confronted me here in the tower with his notebook and his childish theories about vocal deception, I realized that his very existence had become an unbearable threat to my husband's reputation and our life's work in this parish. The method of Thomas's murder emerged through Miss Marple's patient reconstruction, revealing how Mrs. Pemberton had lured the boy to the tower with promises of honest conversation about his concerns, only to push him down the stone steps during a moment when his attention was focused on sharing his musical discoveries, then carefully arranged the scene to suggest accidental death while planting the note that would redirect suspicion toward imagined improprieties involving Mr. Finch. You underestimated Thomas's intelligence and overestimated your ability to control a situation that had grown far beyond anyone's capacity for management, Miss Marple observed with profound sadness, watching as the woman who had seemed the very embodiment of Christian virtue faced the inevitable consequences of choices that had transformed charitable intentions into criminal conspiracy and ultimately cold-blooded murder to protect the illusion of respectability that had become more important than human life itself in their seemingly peaceful village community. The terrible weight of Mrs. Pemberton's confession settled over the small group gathered in the ancient tower like a physical presence, and Miss Marple observed with the gentle attention she brought to all moments of human crisis how each person processed the devastating revelation that their trusted vicar's wife had murdered an innocent child to protect a web of financial deceptions that had grown beyond anyone's ability to control. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes, summoned by the prearranged signal Miss Marple had requested, his heavy footsteps on the stone stairs announcing the arrival of official justice to a scene where personal justice had already been served through the inexorable power of truth carefully assembled and compassionately presented. As the inspector established his authority over the proceedings, Miss Marple quietly produced the evidence she'd gathered with characteristic thoroughness, beginning with Thomas's original note that she had retrieved from beneath the stone cross, its careful script asking whoever might find it to look for answers in the music, and expressing fears about being sent away by adults who claimed to act for his benefit. The boy had no intention of disappearing without leaving some record of his concerns, she explained with quiet sadness, and his reference to plural threats suggested he understood that multiple adults were involved in whatever was troubling him so deeply. The systematic presentation of evidence continued with Thomas's exercise book, which Martha Jenkins had finally found courage to surrender, its pages documenting with innocent precision how adult voices betrayed emotional strain during hymns that touched on themes of mercy, forgiveness, and accountability. Miss Marple's gentle explanation revealed how the boy's remarkable musical sensitivity had allowed him to detect deception in the vocal patterns of respected community members, his careful notations marking moments when Colonel Weatherby's steady bass wavered on words like account and stewardship, when Lady Ashworth's controlled soprano tightened on mercy and render, and most significantly, when Mrs. Pemberton's breathing became irregular during the phrase, "Deliver us from evil." The financial irregularities emerged through Miss Marple's patient reconstruction, revealing unauthorized withdrawals from church accounts that had been concealed through creative bookkeeping, generous donations from Lady Ashworth that served as disguised repayments for borrowed funds, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain the appearance of proper parish management while covering shortfalls that threatened to expose respected citizens to scandal and criminal charges. Colonel Weatherby's confession about the vestry fire came with military precision. His admission that he had destroyed the ledgers in a misguided attempt to protect the vicar and parish from embarrassment, though his quick questions about which documents had survived revealed his personal investment in the destruction of evidence. Mrs. Pemberton's complete psychological collapse followed Miss Marple's gentle but devastating presentation of physical evidence that connected the vicar's wife directly to Thomas's murder, including the violet-scented stationery from the vicarage that had been used for the misleading note found with the boy's body, handwriting analysis that matched her characteristic script, and most damning, the faint dusting of pale mortar on her shoes that could only have come from the ancient tower stones during her struggle with Thomas on those treacherous steps. The poor child came to me with his notebook. She sobbed with the relief of someone finally surrendering an unbearable burden, showing me his careful observations about how our voices betrayed our anxiety, explaining with such innocent pride how he could hear truth beneath our words, and I realized in that terrible moment that his very existence threatened everything we had worked so desperately to protect. The full horror of Thomas's murder emerged through Mrs. Pemberton's broken confession, describing how she had lured the boy to the tower under pretense of honest conversation about his concerns, only to push him down the stone steps during a moment when his attention was focused on demonstrating his vocal analysis theories rather than watching for danger from someone he trusted completely. Her careful staging of the scene to suggest accidental death, combined with the planted note designed to redirect suspicion toward Mr. Finch, revealed the calculating nature of her desperation to preserve her husband's reputation and their life's work in the parish, even at the cost of an innocent child's life. As Mrs. Pemberton was led away with the dignity of someone who had finally stopped pretending, the remaining adults faced the devastating consequences of their involvement in the conspiracy that had made Thomas's murder seem necessary to a woman whose moral compass had been overwhelmed by fear of social ruin and professional destruction. Colonel Weatherby surrendered his keys and offered full disclosure of the irregular accounts, while Lady Ashworth promised public restitution and submission to whatever censure her managing had earned, both understanding that their reputations would never recover from their roles in the tragedy that had cost a gifted child his life. The aftermath settled over St. Mary Mead like autumn mist, transforming a village that had prided itself on peaceful respectability into a community grappling with the uncomfortable truth that the most virtuous-appearing citizens could harbor the darkest secrets when their carefully constructed images were threatened by inconvenient observations from innocent eyes. The church choir would struggle to recover from the loss of Thomas's pure voice and the revelation of the conspiracy that had destroyed him, while neighbors looked at each other with newly suspicious awareness that hidden resentments and buried scandals might lurk beneath any facade of Christian charity and community service. Miss Marple descended the tower steps with profound sadness, reflecting on how Thomas Hartwell's remarkable gift for detecting emotional deception through musical analysis had transformed him from promising scholarship candidate into unwitting threat to adults whose pride had prevented them from seeking help through proper channels, ultimately leading to a tragedy that revealed how human vanity and moral cowardice could masquerade as charitable concern while destroying the very innocence they claimed to protect. As she walked home through streets where golden autumn light was fading into evening shadows, she contemplated once again the enduring truth that the most dangerous criminals often wore masks of respectability and virtue, using the very qualities they claimed to embody as weapons against those whose clarity of vision made them inconvenient witnesses to adult failures and moral compromises in communities that prized appearance above reality and reputation above the protection of innocent children who saw too clearly the deceptions that adults worked so desperately to conceal. Autumn settled over St. Mary Mead with the hesitant quality of a village learning to breathe again after holding its collective breath through weeks of revelation and reckoning. And Miss Marple observed from her cottage window how the ordinary rhythms of daily life gradually reasserted themselves, even as the extraordinary events of recent weeks had fundamentally altered the community's understanding of itself and its most trusted citizens. The Reverend Pemberton departed for an extended retreat with his brother in Dorset, his faith shattered not only by his wife's terrible crime, but by his own unwitting complicity in the financial irregularities that had created the desperate circumstances leading to Thomas's murder. His final sermon, delivered with such raw vulnerability that even Mrs. Price Ridley was moved to tears by his honest acknowledgement of human frailty and the dangerous pride that prevented good people from seeking help when they needed it most. Inspector Slack returned to Much Benham with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully solved a complex case, though Miss Marple suspected his official report would focus on the mechanics of crime and punishment, while missing entirely the tragic irony that Thomas's death had resulted from his remarkable gift for detecting emotional truth in adult voices that believed their secrets were safely hidden beneath layers of respectability and charitable concern. Colonel Weatherby faced the consequences of his involvement with the stoic dignity that characterized his military background, surrendering his position as church warden and offering full restitution for the unauthorized borrowings that had initiated the conspiracy, though his reputation in the village would never recover from the revelation that financial difficulties had made him vulnerable to manipulation disguised as generous assistance from Lady Ashworth. His confession to setting the vestry fire emerged through careful questioning, revealing how his misguided attempt to protect the parish from scandal had actually made him an unwitting accomplice in destroying evidence that might have led investigators to Mrs. Pemberton more quickly, preventing additional suffering for all involved, while demonstrating how even well-intentioned actions could become criminal when motivated by fear of exposure rather than commitment to truth and justice. Lady Ashworth's response proved more complex than simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing, for her aristocratic pride struggled against the necessity of public humiliation, even as genuine remorse over Thomas's death demanded meaningful penance beyond mere financial restitution, leading to her establishment of a music scholarship fund in the boy's name that represented both appropriate memorial and subtle attempt to rehabilitate her reputation through charitable gesture. Mr. Finch, cleared of all suspicion but deeply scarred by the ordeal of being considered a potential predator, initially submitted his resignation as organist and choir master before being persuaded by village petition to remain, understanding that his sensitive nature required time to heal from the trauma of false accusation, even as his genuine love of music and dedication to the remaining choir members ultimately proved stronger than his wounded pride. The church itself seemed diminished by recent events, its ancient stones bearing witness to human frailty that challenged comfortable assumptions about Christian virtue and community solidarity, and Sunday services attracted smaller congregations whose hymn-singing lacked the confident joy that had characterized worship when Thomas's pure voice had soared above the rest with ethereal beauty that now existed only in memory and in the careful notations he had left behind. Martha Jenkins, Thomas's aunt, found a measure of peace in finally understanding the truth behind her nephew's death, though it was harsh comfort that transformed her grief from confused anguish into focused sorrow, and she guarded his exercise book as a sacred trust, allowing Miss Marple to copy several pages for official records, while preserving the rest as testament to a remarkable child whose sensitivity to human deception had ultimately cost him his life. Thomas's funeral, delayed by investigation and legal proceedings, finally took place on a grey November morning when the first frost had silvered the ancient yew, and the small gathering of genuine mourners contrasted sharply with the larger crowd that had attended the harvest festival where his tragedy began, the choir's tribute to their lost member proving almost unbearably poignant as their voices struggled with harmonies Thomas had once made effortless. Peter Blackwood, now the choir's reluctant soloist, possessed technical competence but lacked the transcendent quality that had made Thomas's singing magical. His brave attempt to honor his friend's memory serving as painful reminder of how much beauty had been lost through adult failures to protect innocence from the consequences of pride and financial desperation that had seemed more important than a child's welfare. Miss Marple attended the service with quiet attention, her observations encompassing both genuine grief and the complex emotions of community members grappling with their roles in creating circumstances that had made murder seem necessary to a desperate woman whose moral compass had been overwhelmed by fear of social ruin. And as the final prayers were spoken, she reflected on how Thomas's death had revealed uncomfortable truths about the price of maintaining appearances in communities where reputation mattered more than reality. The investigation's conclusion brought justice, but could not restore the innocence lost when St. Mary Mead discovered that its most trusted citizens were capable of conspiracy and murder to protect carefully constructed images of virtue. Mrs. Pemberton's crime exposing the dangerous gap between public persona and private reality that existed even in the most peaceful villages, where hidden resentments could fester until they exploded into violence that destroyed not only immediate victims, but the social fabric holding neighbors together in mutual trust. As winter settled over the village and life gradually resumed its ordinary patterns, Miss Marple continued her gentle observations of human nature, understanding that while the immediate crisis had passed, the lessons learned about the fragility of community bonds and the terrible consequences of pride would resonate for years to come. In a place that had learned too late that the most beautiful voices sometimes belonged to those whose clarity of vision made them inconvenient witnesses to adult moral compromises in their seemingly peaceful world. Winter descended upon St. Mary Mead with the quiet persistence of truth finally acknowledged, transforming the village into something both beautiful and forever changed, and Miss Marple observed from her cottage window how communities, like individuals, must learn to carry their scars with dignity while slowly rebuilding the trust that tragedy had shattered. The first snow had covered Thomas Hartwell's grave with pristine white that seemed to offer a kind of peace, though the simple headstone bearing musical notation from his favorite hymn served as permanent reminder that innocence, once lost to adult failures and moral compromises, could never be fully restored to a place that had learned too much about the dangerous gap between appearance and reality in their seemingly peaceful world. The Reverend Pemberton's departure for an extended retreat with his brother in Dorset left the parish in the capable hands of Father Matthews, a young curate whose transparent sincerity and earnest dedication gradually restored faith in the possibility of spiritual leadership that prioritized truth over reputation, his sermons delivered with genuine vulnerability rather than polished rhetoric as the congregation slowly learned to distinguish between authentic virtue and its carefully constructed imitation. Colonel Weatherby's quiet removal to his sister's home near Bath occurred with military precision and minimal fanfare, his cottage sold to a retired school teacher whose presence brought no complicated history or hidden obligations, though his final salute to the ancient yew suggested a man who understood that his worst punishment was knowledge that fear had made him less than the soldier he had trained himself to be. throughout his distinguished career. Lady Ashworth's establishment of the Thomas Hartwell Music Scholarship Fund represented both appropriate memorial and subtle attempt at rehabilitation. Her continued residence at the manor creating ongoing tensions, neighbors struggled to balance acknowledgement of genuine remorse against awareness of her role in creating circumstances that had made murder seem necessary to a desperate woman protecting secrets that should never have existed in their Christian community. Mr. Finch's gradual recovery from the trauma of false accusation proved more complete than anyone had expected. His sensitive nature finding healing through renewed dedication to musical excellence that honored Thomas's memory while rebuilding the choir's confidence, his fingers steady on the organ keys as he guided the remaining boys through harmonies that carried deeper understanding of how music could convey emotional truth that words alone could never express with such devastating clarity. Peter Blackwood's brave attempts to fill the void left by his friend's death demonstrated remarkable maturity as he learned to sing with the weight of experience far beyond his years, his voice carrying honest emotion rather than perfect technique, while Mr. Finch emphasized truth over pure tone, understanding that the congregation had learned something about honesty lately and needed music that acknowledged their shared journey through darkness toward whatever light remained possible. The children of St. Mary Mead, particularly those who had been close to Thomas, looked at their elders with new eyes that seemed perpetually searching for the hidden false notes their friend had taught them could betray deeper truths. Their innocence shattered, but their wisdom increased through exposure to adult complexities they should never have needed to comprehend at such tender ages. Martha Jenkins found quiet strength in her sorrow, moving to a smaller cottage near the church where she could tend Thomas's grave and volunteer in the parish office, ensuring that every penny was meticulously documented while preserving her nephew's exercise book as sacred trust that honored his remarkable gift for detecting emotional deception through careful observation, how voices betrayed what hearts attempted to conceal. The church itself seemed to exhale slowly as winter progressed, its ancient stones gradually releasing tension that had accumulated during weeks of investigation and revelation. Sunday services recovering their peaceful rhythm, though the new pale stones replacing those blackened by fire served as visible reminder of destructive forces that had erupted from within their midst. Miss Marple's role in solving Thomas's murder brought the usual mixture of gratitude and wariness that characterized village responses to her investigative abilities. Her gentle observations about human nature, offering comfort without condescension to people struggling to understand how pride and financial desperation had transformed respected citizens into accomplices. To evil when protecting reputation became more important than protecting innocent life. As spring approached with tentative signs of renewal, daffodils pushing through soil that had been frozen during the darkest weeks, she reflected on how the cycle of seasons mirrored patterns of human behavior she had observed throughout her long life, understanding that communities required constant tending to prevent the growth of weeds that could choke out more delicate plants. The lessons learned through Thomas Hartwell's tragic death would resonate through St. Mary Mead for generations, serving as permanent reminder that the most dangerous criminals often wore masks of respectability while using the very virtues they claimed to embody as weapons against those whose clarity of vision made them inconvenient witnesses to moral compromises that seemed necessary for maintaining comfortable illusions. As Miss Marple prepared her garden for another growing season, she understood that while spring would return with its promise of renewal, the village had been forever changed by discovering that even the most beautiful voices sometimes belonged to those whose sensitivity made them threats to adults who preferred appearance over reality, and that the price of maintaining true beauty and innocence was eternal vigilance against the pride and fear that could transform good people into something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined possible in their peaceful world.